You're listening to the Birds on Power Lines podcast. Now we're talking about the Netflix series The Sandman, Season 1. We saw that Season 2 is just about done filming, so we thought we would revisit and take a deep dive into the story so far. In this podcast, we discuss the first 3 chapters, Sleep of the Just, Imperfect Hosts, and Dream a Little Dream of Me. So join us as we revisit The Sandman, Season 1. I'm really glad that we're seeing this season of The Sandman again and really giving me a chance to sit down and watch it, because the first time you guys were watching it, and you guys being you and Dad, I wasn't watching the first episodes, and I don't think I really sat down until halfway through the season, and a lot of it didn't make sense. I mean, I enjoyed it, but it didn't really mean as much to me in terms of what was happening. And of course you had read it, so you already knew all this stuff and you were trying to explain it to me. Just, it just didn't make any sense. But then I had seen a couple of those episodes again when we were on an airplane going somewhere. They had it on the plane, so that helped. But I still never saw the first episode, and and that kind of really took a lot away from me. So I don't really think I saw the first episode until a couple of weeks ago. And I sat down and I said, let's watch that first episode. And then I saw it and I was like, oh, okay, that all makes sense. Now I know where everything's coming from. And I knew could see about the Corinthian and sort of what was set up there. And, how he lost all of his I guess weapons or his things that he has, his sand and his jewel and his mask, because I didn't understand how he lost all of that. So now that made sense. But now seeing this a second time, I'm really struck by how rich the series is. I mean, there's so much there that on the first viewing, I mean, you see it, but you don't really absorb it. So now seeing it again, I'm absorbing the words that he says when he describes humanity, meaning dream, and the amazing cinematography that's going on there. And the other thing that I was really struck by, that I really noticed this time, is that you don't actually see Dream until well into the episode. I mean, you see him, obviously, you see him naked in the ring after Roderick Burgess captures him with the spell. But you don't really see his face. I mean, you see him naked, but you don't see his face. And I don't think you really see his face until Alex shoots Jessamy, and he gets up to see Jessamy, and then you see his face, and then you can sort of see that whole judgment that he passes on to Alex, and that he's going to kill Alex. But anyways, but before that, you just sort of see him sideways. You don't really see him full on, and really not completely until the death of Roderick. So that really, really struck me, and I didn't really realize that until now, the second time actually looking at this. So I'm really glad we're doing this, because I'm really getting a lot of things that I didn't see before, and I think that this is going to make the whole thing a lot richer for me, and now especially I can really understand what's going on and how that's set up, which I really was lost on me the first time around.
Well, this is my 4th time watching episode 1 all the way through, and my 3rd rewatch of Sandman as a series, but it never gets old. It's just so good. And I mean, even the whole, 2 things I want to talk about. First of all, 3. First of all, the opening, the whole opening sequence is just one of those things that just itches that spot in your brain that it's just really nice. At least for me, that's definitely one of the top 10 openings of anything ever, in my opinion. It's probably top 5. It's really, really good. I just love it, and part of the reason why I love it is, the combination of both the interesting camera angles, I mean, throughout the whole series, but I really love, like, the interesting camera angles. Like, they're just, sometimes they're slightly tilted, sometimes they flip upside down, sometimes, and then sometimes, especially I love when they're following, like, the, Jessamy, when they're following Jessamy in this opening sequence. I love it. And, and of course, I can't talk about the show without, of course, talking about the soundtrack, the music, because, like, I love music. And the whole soundtrack for the entire series, but especially the opening, like, the main theme, it's so perfect. I mean, I read the comics before I saw the show, but I of course wasn't, like, the time frame between, like, the 1980s when they were originally published to now. I read them maybe a few months before the show came out. But really, the soundtrack, like, it just hits it spot on, and it's another one of those things, one of those soundtracks that, like, I have very few soundtracks that I love that just itch that certain spot in your brain, like I was talking about with the opening credits. It's perfect. It just works. And I just love it. I love so many things about the show, but that opening, the soundtrack, and the camera angles, those are probably my top three things. And especially they're showcased so much in episode 1, and it's such a strong opening. I mean, it's you know that you get to know the characters, but it's not, like, thrust upon you, but you're also in the middle of all the action. And it's just, I know, of course, Neil Gaiman, obviously, he made everything. It's all based on the comics. Like, a lot of the scenes are almost word for word in this whole show. A lot of the scenes are almost word for word from the comics, but even though they do stick very closely to the original source material, I really love the fact that, I mean, first of all, they updated it. They have a more modern take on a lot of the things that happened, and of course they bumped up the timeline to take place in the present day. But, like, it's almost both, like, a coming home for people who love the comics and something entirely new, so that it's, like, it's not, an homage wouldn't be the right word, but, like, it's just, it encapsulates the spirit of what I feel like I got out of reading the comics for the first time in moving form, and it's so brilliant for that. But I mean, moving on from, like, talking about, like, the makeup of the show itself, I mean, personally, I do really like Dream as a character, possibly because, like, I mean, he's just, his whole, like, aesthetic is just very, very pleasing to me. But he can be a bit, he can be a bit Dream. He can be very, very, like, unforgiving, and honestly a little bit of a, I mean, for lack of a better term, a little bit of, like, a stick in the mud, very, like, almost, like, very very detached from the reality of the humans that he, like, almost, like, he governs their unconsciousness, so he sees, like, them from almost the inside. Like, he sees the parts of them, of us, that we might not even know are there ourselves. Therefore, I feel like it gives him almost like a sort of a bit of a warped sense of what people are like. Therefore, he's less willing to kind of, I mean, yeah, I get, like you said, like, he's not really, like, willing to give Alex a break. I mean, that was, like, one thing that made me a little bit, not uncomfortable, just a little bit, that's interesting, made me go, that's interesting, throughout this episode, and it repeatedly, like, when I watch it, and also, like, when I read the comics the first time. I mean, honestly, yes, Alex did kill Jessamy, but, like, this is made even more obvious in the show. He really is only doing a lot of these things because, like, of this deep-seated insecurity that his father has impressed upon him, that he's not good enough, that he is, like, the second son. He's not even, like, treated really as his son. And I mean, I definitely don't like the Magus. I don't like his character at all. Repeatedly watching it, don't like it. Didn't like him in the comics. But I feel like the contrast between comics Alex and show Alex, I mean, since you didn't read the comics, but I have, he's made... like he seems a little bit more like vulnerable and a little bit more relatable. The show kind of wants you to feel bad for him, or so I feel. He's more like of a sympathetic character because he's someone who just is trying to live up to others' expectations of him, which is something that I'm sure a lot of people can relate to. And he's almost afraid to be his own person. I mean, he said he wanted to free Dream. He would have done it if he could, but he felt he couldn't, even after his father died. We saw that scene. He was about to free Dream, but then one of the security guards said, "What would your father think? What would your father do?" And that was what kept him, even like what must have been 80-ish, 90 years later in the show timeline. That's what always stopped him from actually going through with it. The lingering thought of what would my father do, or what would my father think or say. And that's just something that's so, I mean, that just hits like on another level. I mean, I can't relate to anything like that, but like really just the general concept of wanting to do something but being afraid to because of what others would think and what others would say, and especially someone who holds a lot of power over you, like your father or whatever, some like person who has power over you even after they're gone, them still having such like a lasting, deep-seated impact on you. And like this kind of almost not determination, but this whole like dynamic between Alex and his father having such like a deep impact on Alex, and Dream's like determination and very like stubbornness to not forgive Alex. It just paints like a very interesting parallel that I really did like in episode 1.
I think it's really interesting that you're having those feelings about Dream. Like, of course, I share your sentiment about the Magus or Roderick. He's really not one of my favorite people, and he is really evil to Alex. But you know, the thing is, I do understand a bit why Dream doesn't forgive him. I hate to say it, but as much as I feel bad for Alex, I do have that feeling that, you know, Alex did. I'm not going to say he deserved what happened, but I could see a being like Dream being unforgiving, right? Especially at the beginning of the series, because like you said, he doesn't really relate to humans that well, right? And he doesn't really want to be dependent on anyone, and he doesn't have like a real connection to people, right? I feel like his only connection really is with his raven. But that said, right, so this brings me to the point that I was thinking about actually all day today, and thinking again about how we see Dream at the beginning, and there's like really a choice that was made, because he's obviously very powerful, right? But for almost the entire episode, you don't see him as being powerful. You see him as being completely vulnerable and at the mercy of what's happening in his situation. And I think that because of that, even though he is kind of not connected to humans, you actually have a soft spot for him, because you've seen him be vulnerable right away, right? And I think that's really quite something. I mean, even when he gets back to his realm, I mean, he's just laying on the beach and he's just completely exhausted. And so I think that really is an important device that's used at the beginning of the story. And I don't know how it's done in the comics, but This was really something that I was thinking about. So even though he is, I guess, a curmudgeon in a way, it's not really a curmudgeon, but he's really, he understands who he is, and he takes his responsibility very seriously. And, you're right. He doesn't have a connection really with humans. I think that develops over the season. He starts to understand things a little bit better. Because I think he has this impression that he does understand humans because he sees what they dream. But that's not the full story, right? And, but even though he is so powerful, there is this, you see how vulnerable he is at the very beginning. And I think that was really an important part of this first season. I mean, the first episode of the first season. So that was another thing that I was thinking about.
Yeah, I mean, I agree a lot with everything you just said, and I mean, I was trying to get at that a little bit too, but and moving on to episode 2, actually the one of the things that I kind of noticed between episode 1 and episode 2 was the fact that in like the real world, in like the Earth world, when Morpheus like speaks, it's very like echoey and reverberating, but in the dreaming they chose to not add that onto his voice. Like his voice still has like that same like, I guess, aura of like dignified like kingliness, I guess, but in Earth, like in the real world, he has more of like a otherworldly sound to his voice, like the effects on his voice. And I thought that was really interesting because, I mean, since I've read the comics, no matter where he is, Morpheus always has this marked, like, his text box, they're always black with white words, and they're always a little bit, like, spiky, as opposed to most other characters, like normal humans. It's just his normal comic book lettering. And then, like, Desire, for example, has different lettering, but it's always white background, whereas Morpheus is the only character who ever has a black background and like a very distinct font and distinct background to his speech bubbles. And I think it was an interesting choice that the producers decided to not keep this all the time, only keep this in reality. And I mean, also, like, thinking really episode 2, I thought really focused very much on Morpheus as almost like a setup for what's going to happen for the rest of the series. Like, it's building, I think, empathy a bit for him, because of course in episode 1 we didn't really see things from his perspective. He's just like a little bit like strange and scary. But I think honestly episode 2, especially given the placement of episode 2 in relation to the rest of the series, really kind of emphasized his humanity. I mean, because of course he's one of the endless, he's not human, he is very detached from humanity itself. But I feel like episode 2 kind of, I mean, especially with taking the gargoyle, and like we can see that he's very clearly devastated by taking Gregory, but he also like, it's shown that he appreciates both Cain and Abel and Gregory, of course, for like allowing him to make this sacrifice in order to rebuild the dreaming by giving them Goldie, which I thought like was very sweet, because of course he doesn't have to do that. He didn't have to do that. He's the king of the dreaming. He's one of the endless. He doesn't owe anything to anyone. But the fact that he takes the time to think of them when, like, he's going about and trying to get all of his tools back. He's clearly in a crisis himself, but he still wants to show the fact that he appreciates Cain and Abel for staying, and of course Gregory for staying in the dreaming, even though so many other people, all of like his creations abandoned him pretty much. And also like his whole dynamic with Lucien. I just thought like it, honestly, I like Lucien like insisting that he takes a raven with him even though he doesn't want to after what happened to Jessamy. It just shows that like she's just such a caring, not only like the librarian, the head librarian. She's not only like basically his second in command, but she's also his friend. And even though he might at this point might not want to admit that. And like we see later on in the series, we see that he, of course, doesn't want to rely on anyone. But specifically in this episode, we see that we can tell he doesn't like relying on people to solve things for him. But he does crave that connection. Like, he is hurt that his family didn't step in to help him. But he does value the fact that there are certain people around him that are willing to stay. And I think as time goes on, we see him appreciate these connections more and more, and begins to like reciprocate them and be like, have it be more of a two-sided relationship than just people who care about him and him just being like, okay, cool. Because I feel like a bit he doesn't know how to react to someone showing concern or compassion for him. So he just kind of shrinks into himself and just powers through things when things go wrong. But really, like, I think like this whole season, but specifically episode 2, we see the start of him beginning to trust that people have his back, and he wants to show that he has their back. So really, I think episode 2, although it doesn't really, and I said this when we finished the episode, it doesn't really advance the plot a huge amount, but it really builds the characters up, and I think that was like the best time for the story to do that. It was the best time for the story to build the characters. Before we really get to know them, before we really get into the plot, we want to have a nice, strong foundation, and I think episode 2 did exactly that.
That is so interesting. You know, to be honest, I didn't really notice that until now that you mentioned it, because I just know his voice sounds very sort of distant somehow. But I think because you are aware of the differences in the word bubbles in the comics, that really made you very aware of it. And I'm glad you pointed that out to me. And I'm just sort of thinking about it because I know this is my second time seeing it. And I don't think that they do this all the way through. And I think that's interesting because, and I'm going to pay attention as we watch it through the other episodes. And I'm thinking particularly when he is starting to interact more with people in the world, with his sister Death, and he's starting to talk to people. And I don't think that his voice sounds like that at that time. So I'm predicting that there's some sort of a change that's happening as we go through the season, and now I'm going to pay more attention to that. So yeah, that's really cool because I like I said, I had no idea that they did that with the word bubbles, and that would make a lot of sense. So yeah, and you know the other thing is that I think his voice wouldn't sound like that when he's at home, right? Because he's in his creation, in his realm, and that's where he's, I guess, sort of real in a way, like that's where he lives, and that's, where he's at home. And I think that would be a reason for it to be kind of normal in that case. And then also with this second episode or second chapter, I think we're seeing him suffer. And I think that's really interesting because you would think that with the endless that they don't really suffer, but he's definitely suffering. And I think this ordeal has given him empathy. And I think that when he goes back to his realm, he really recognized the sacrifice that Cain and Abel made, and Lucienne, and the fact that the rest of his creation or his created dreams or what they are were gone, and that devastated him and brought home some sort of level of reality. And then you also see how devastated he is about Jessamy, and when Lucienne asks him to get another raven, and he just doesn't want to do it, and I guess that was just too painful to him. And and I think in terms of advancing the plot, I think really what's happening here is we're getting to know the other characters. And a few things surprised me. Like, I was surprised that Ethel didn't keep any of those tools. And I was really, and I, now looking at it again, I had forgotten that she had the amulet. I was thinking she still had the ruby, but now, yeah, so she didn't hold on to any of them. And I'm kind of wondering where she got that amulet from. But I really think it's interesting that she let all of those go. And I think that's an interesting thing. And I have a feeling that might be because she had worried that eventually Dream would get free and come looking for his things, right? So, or maybe she just was afraid that the Magus was going to come and try and get them all back. So I find that interesting, and I think they do address this a little bit more in the third episode. I just can't remember everything, so when we watch it, I'll pay a bit more attention. And then the other thing about advancing the plot, I think that in addition to giving Dream some humility, we are also learning how dangerous the other characters are and how difficult it's going to be for him to get his tools back. And I really think that you also see how important the dreaming is, right? So what happens in the world with when he isn't there, and now that it's all kind of fallen to pieces, and how important it is that he puts everything back. And yeah, you're right. He doesn't want any help. And I think that is another part of his character that is going to slowly transform. He's going to become more, it sounds weird, become more human or start to understand a little bit more about humanity. And I think that is, important plot device that's happening here in the second episode. So, yeah, so as we go through, I'm going to start looking for these things and really pay attention to how he's changing. And I also want to see if his voice also changes as well as he goes through. And really, he's considering he's been around forever, basically, he's going to grow a lot. And it's interesting that his personality is what it is, and now he's starting to grow. And I think that was sort of a benefit of him suffering and being held captive for so long. And I think that's really going to be interesting. And I'm going to really pay attention to that as we continue to go through these episodes. And then, still reflecting on the second chapter, something that really struck me was the fact that when Dream decided that he needed Gregory, I really found it interesting that, I mean, I know he sort of asked Cain and Abel about it, but he made a point of saying that he doesn't really need their permission. He really needed the permission of Gregory. And I just loved that whole interaction that he had with Gregory, and you could actually tell how much respect that Dream has for his creation. And I mean, you even see a little bit of that with the Corinthian, which is really interesting because the Corinthian has gone completely rogue, but he does acknowledge them as not just his creations, but that they are entities, right? And unlike the Corinthian, you see with Gregory how much Gregory actually really loves Dream, and I think it's just really interesting to see that contrast, and the difference between these creations, and it's nice to see that affection, right? Because there isn't a lot of affection so far in Sandman. But the other place where there is that affection, and I mean, I would say it's love, and that would also be with Lucienne. And she genuinely cares for Dream, and unlike Dream's interaction with Gregory, I don't think, at least right now, that he really acknowledges Lucienne's devotion to him. I think he starts to do that because he's like, he does say, you know, you stayed, you know, whereas, you know, so much of his, you know, people or entities that were in the dreaming disappeared. And he acknowledges that. And I think in a way he's almost surprised, like, because I guess he didn't realize how devoted that she was to him. And I think he just sort of took for granted people's devotion and that they would always just be there because he is who he is. And he realizes now that that's not the case. And and I think that made it even harder for him to sort of make that request of Gregory. But then you could see how willingly Gregory gave essentially his life to Sandman. And I guess it would be an acknowledgement that, you know, he had that opportunity because he was created by Dream. And it's just, I just found that those two interactions were really interesting. So the interaction between Gregory and Dream, as well as between Lucienne and Dream, and just seeing how, you know, with Lucienne, how that's going to develop, and knowingly that, you know, she really is looking out for him, and now he's starting to realize it, and I, you know, just another thought as we move forward into the next chapter.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that you made about, like, him specifically asking Gregory, the point we both made about him specifically asking Gregory for permission, that was, like, something that was very noticeable. And, you know, I was actually thinking, watching this again, I actually went back to the comics, and actually, in the comics, Dream didn't take Gregory, and he didn't give Cain and Abel Goldie. Actually, it was, he took 2 letters that he gave to Cain and Abel that he signed, and he took his essence out of that. He didn't do anything with Gregory, and Goldie was actually a present from I think it was from Cain to Abel, I think. Or Abel to, no, I think it was Abel to Cain, I think. But actually, he actually did not do anything with either of the gargoyles in the comics, and I thought it was interesting that the show decided to actually change that. And I thought it made it a bit more, like, a bit more meaningful, and it provided, like, a lot of exposition for, like, what exactly the dreaming is and what goes on in the dreaming. And it also did, I think, help develop, or help, like, kickstart the development of Morpheus's character. Because really, in the comics, like, he took the letters and took a bit of his power from them, and then just went out to find the fates and ask them the questions that he needed answered. But I feel like by changing the exact nuances of the events that occurred, in such that involving Gregory more and changing the origin of where Goldie came from, it definitely it made the show more emotional, I think, and like I said, it also served to make Dream's character feel more human and more, like, connectable with. And I think, honestly, I think part of the reason is that, like, even though the show in general didn't change, like, at least the first season stayed very, very true to the comics, and especially the spirit of a lot of the events that happened in the comics and why they happened, and what the social commentary was on these events. Because, of course, they're, like, a lot of these ideas were and still are very timeless ideas and, like, lessons to be learned from them.
Well, I think that's pretty interesting with the comparison with the comics. Like, I think it's really, I guess, satisfying knowing that I'm watching this series and it's pretty similar to what is in the comics. But it's interesting that they made that change with Goldie and Gregory. I mean, I guess I do agree that having Dream need to use Gregory really raises the stakes, and because, I mean, from your description, using letters just doesn't sound so, I don't know, je ne sais quoi, right? But using something like Gregory, that's a beloved creation, not just for Cain and Abel, but for Dream himself, and having to use him sort of as a sacrifice, or sacrificing him to save the dreaming, I think is a little bit more impactful. And yeah, it also shows how desperate that Dream is in a way, even though he's, being kingly and trying to do everything on his own. It really shows that, there is, that it shows how high the stakes are. So I think that would be why they would do that, because maybe I'm not understanding what you're describing correctly from the comics, but that doesn't sound so exciting to me, or as intriguing, I guess is probably the better word. So I'm going to guess that that's probably why they made that choice. But it's weird though. Then how would Goldie be manifested though? If Dream didn't give them Goldie. So I'm just wondering how there could be a creation in the dreaming that wasn't from Dream. Anyways, but obviously I'm not fully appreciating that. But anyways, that's interesting, and really I find that cool that the story is still pretty similar to what is in the comic book. And then thinking about the third part, so Dream a Little Dream of Me. I think with this episode, the thing I enjoyed the most, I mean, it's an intriguing story with Constantine and stuff. And then at the end, the Corinthian is always showing up, which, is creepy. But I think what I really enjoyed was a lot of the imagery. And the imagery is great anyways in Sandman, but I really was drawn into Constantine's nightmare with Astra, and intrigued by how much of that was a dream and not fully a dream, as Dream had said. And then that part where Constantine's ex-girlfriend Rachel just sort of disintegrates into sand. I thought, like, even though I'd seen this before, it still struck me as disturbing, and I really found that, that image really quite spectacular in some way for myself. And then of course the introduction to Matthew. I mean, who doesn't love Matthew? At first I was a little confused as to how he could become a raven after he died. But I think it's because he died while he was sleeping, so he must have been dreaming. But I find it interesting, and I'm wondering who Lucienne is in that she has the power to take, I guess, the soul of someone who died in their sleep and manifest him into the Raven for Dream. I'm wondering how she's able to do that. So I find that interesting, and I'm intrigued by that. I don't know if the comics say anything about that, but yeah. So Matthew, I think he adds a lot of levity to the situation just because he's funny, right? He just really brings a real contrast to a lot of what's going on, which can be quite dark. And then of course that whole continuing with John and Ethel, that's a whole other aspect to this that is, kind of creepy. And John, I always think is creepy, but, and then this whole thing about them being in Buffalo, New York. And since we're so close to Buffalo, here on Birds on Power Lines, I just find it interesting that this is happening in Buffalo, because it feels kind of local, and I'm not used to seeing that. I mean, when we were living in New York City, that was different, but up here in upstate New York is kind of interesting to see it. So yeah, but that the continuation with John and Ethel, and really seeing how disturbed John is and how he legitimizes the deaths that he had caused, apparently, and now we know why he's he's being essentially imprisoned in that sort of hospital kind of situation. And the violence of him leaving, of course, because of the amulet. But so going on with that, and that's going to keep going in the next. I guess in the next couple of chapters we'll see a little bit more of this whole thing with John. I guess it culminates in a couple from now. But yeah, so that ongoing story with John and Ethel, and with Ethel, I'm a little. I guess I'm also conflicted with that, because in the first chapter, she was very kind to Alex. And I guess because she was younger, I guess she was more, sort of innocent. And I feel that as her character develops in the next, in the third parts, you can see that there's a lot of an edge to her. And I think that she sort of transforms, I guess, because she's trying to protect herself and her son, John. But I also feel like there's sort of a, you don't trust her as much somehow. So that's sort of a change from the first chapter. But at the same time, I guess they're trying to bring her full circle before she gives the amulet to John, and showing that her motivations really were for his protection. And I'm still wondering if that was fully true. But I guess in the end, she did give him the amulet to try and protect him from Dream. And so that he could, give everything back to Dream and still live forever, which is, what she wanted for him. So I guess so, but I just felt like in the second part there was, they gave her a bit of an edge that I felt was not in the first episode in Sleep of the Just. And I guess she comes back, in this third part. But yeah, I'm still trying to think about that. I mean, I know we're not going to see Ethel anymore, and we are going to see John, but I think that, I'm still sort of, reconciling exactly who she was in terms of her motivations. I mean, I guess she had this desire to be with the Magus, or, Roderick Burgess in the beginning. So I guess in a way she was sort of trying to live at this sort of exciting life, and was intrigued by, I guess, the danger that he had around him somehow. She's a character I'd like to learn a little bit more. I don't know if they talk more or about her in the comics as to what her motivations were, but I just feel that there's this sort of aspect to her that I'm not fully thinking about. And I guess if I would watch the episodes again, I would get more of a consensus on how I feel about Ethel. I think my feelings on John are pretty clear, though. But anyway, so again, we'll keep watching and think about this first season.
Yeah, I mean, you clearly definitely thought a lot about this episode, and I mean, honestly, like the thing that that stuck out for me the most is I think it's interesting that they changed, like in the comics, Joanna was John Constantine, who's like a famous DC character and is in a lot of different DC comics, not just Sandman. He's like all over the place. He's like known for being in all these different comics at the same time. But I think it's interesting that they decided to change that. I mean, I know the like official reason is that Neil said that like it was easier to have Johanna played by both by the same actress for both Johanna Constantine and her like ancestor that we see in episode 6 when her ancestor confronts Hob and Dream in the pub. But I think it is interesting that actually in DC Comics itself, both Johanna and John exist at the same time. They're both separate characters. So I think it's pretty interesting. I mean, personally, I think that it might have been because they just didn't want to have two characters named John in the TV series, and they would have had John Constantine and John D /Cripps/Burgess. That's what I personally think about that. But Yeah, I just think it was an interesting casting decision that they decided to make, and of course I think that the actress who played Johanna plays her very well, very convincing, and really, like, I mean, honestly, whether the character was a woman or a man, that doesn't really take anything away or add anything to the message that was trying to be conveyed through the story and the overall like heart of the little story itself. But I think it was an interesting decision that was made. But actually, what you mentioned about the sand with Rachel dissolving into sand, I honestly didn't really view it as disturbing. I actually never really thought about that. I just thought of it more as like a peaceful moment that she was like finally given like a bit of a release from the suffering that the sand was putting her through. But anyway, and also Matthew, you mentioned Matthew. Matthew's my favorite character. Love Matthew. He's amazing. But, you know, they actually did not explain in the comics. I'm only about halfway through the entire run, but so far, Neil has not explained how Lucien was able to, like, take dead Matthew and make him a raven. And honestly, I'm kind of wondering if that the same thing was done with Jessamy or not. Because of course, like, yes, they are both two different varieties of crow. One, Jessamy was a European crow, and Matthew's just a normal North American crow. And I mean, we never heard Jessamy speak. Even the comics, Jessamy never spoke, as far as I've read. So I'm kind of wondering, was Jessamy also a person that became a raven, or was she entirely created, like, in the dreaming? So that's something interesting that, who knows, maybe eventually I'll find out when I read more. But that was something that came to mind. But, really, like, it's interesting to see how both Ethel and John change, well, especially John changed throughout, like, the first half of the season, because, like, we kind of see why the Corinthian, like, thrives so much in, like, on Earth, in the real world, because, like, really that, like, well, I think John more so kind of shows the, like, not innocent, but, like, almost kind of, like, natural, a natural tendency for people to do bad things, and then just kind of try and explain away why they're doing these bad things, or, like, something like that. Like, because the Corinthians kind of, like, he's a nightmare, and he was created out of the things that terrify people, and fundamentally, like, I think oftentimes it is people that terrify people, and, like, that's, like, I feel like that's kind of also why he's almost helping John, because we know that John, before he, like, killed a whole bunch of people, but he still almost, like, doesn't see the facts, as you said, he doesn't, like, kind of acknowledge the fact that he, like, actually he killed people, like, he doesn't really acknowledge that fact, and it's just so interesting that, like, all of the people in the show itself, so, like, Ethel and John, and then later, like, Rose, Unity, and then, like, some one-time characters, Hob and Johanna, really, like, they seem to show and, like, demonstrate just the extent of the multifaceted extent to which, like, humanity, like, human nature, they really didn't demonstrate the how human nature just is kind of really confusing and crazy and so general and broad, and, like, really the uniqueness of each individual, through the lens of someone who is, like, removed from humanity. Dream is removed from humanity. He's not human. He's someone, like, almost experiencing humanity from the outside in, even though he is such, like, a fundamental part to what makes people, because, of course, like, as he said, if he didn't exist, if the dreaming didn't exist, then humanity wouldn't exist. So I just think it's so interesting that, like, I think really the series itself, it goes through the dreams of people, the hopes of people, the dreams they have for themselves, for others, for the world around them, and just presents them all to us and kind of leaves the viewer or the reader of the comics, like, it leaves it up to them to decide what would you do? What do you think is right? It doesn't, like, really, even with, like, the, like, quote unquote evil characters such as John, it doesn't, like, explicitly frame them as someone evil. It frames them as someone human. And I just think this is very, very, very interesting. At least that's how I've read it and viewed it. It frames them as someone human, and you're kind of left as the viewer, as the reader, to draw your own conclusions about them. And I don't know, I just think that's really interesting. It's only episode 3, but I'm already getting a little bit deep. What do you think?
That's really interesting with Constantine. So again, thank you for bringing in the comics, because obviously I've not read them. And I think that's really an interesting facet, because I am really not familiar with DC Comics. As you know, when I was young, my thing was Spider-Man. So really I know a little bit more about Marvel, I guess, because of that, even though I wouldn't say I'm an expert on these kinds of things. But, you know, and with Spider-Man, you know, I'm not even sure about my feelings on the Spider-Verse or whatever that is, the multiverse in Spider-Man. I don't know. Anyways, so I'm not really, you know, one that follows all of these things so acutely, but I'm aware of them. But so this was interesting, because like with DC, I know very little. So I didn't know that they have a character like this that goes into all these comics. But I do think that it is likely that, you know, in terms of filmography, that they would make these two characters different, and have one, you know, so because other people might not know about Constantine, because I mean I don't, you know, but I love watching Sandman, so it's to make them more like two separate people, so you know, which I think is, you know, is a valid kind of idea to do. But, you know, even so, like with that, I know that, and I don't know how much control Neil ultimately has on casting, but I know every Neil Gaiman fan likes to think he has ultimate control on everything, which he doesn't. But I think I've read somewhere that Neil would, you know, I think particularly with Sandman, he likes to go with the best person. So I don't know if that also had something to come into it. So anyways, another thought. And then this whole thing with Jessamy, you know, I had to look this up, because I you know, in listening to you, you know, thinking of Jessamy as a European hooded crow. All right. So, but she's a raven. Okay. And so there's this whole thing, and I actually wanted to look at what this confusion was, because since we were in Berlin, I guess now it's a year and a half ago. We were there for, you know, for people listening to this. We went for Christmas, because we have family there. And we were really struck by the crows, which are hooded crows, instead of what we are usually seeing here in North America. So, you know, we're Canadian and American. So, you know, so we're used to our plain old black crows, which we love, not to discount our crows. We love crows. We're like huge crow fans here. So I kind of looked into this, and apparently there's this perception, you know, this whole thing, you know, what kind of bird was Jessamy? And you know, maybe she's a magpie and not a raven, but she's definitely a raven. And, you know, and there's this whole, you know, I'm going to go all science on you here, but there's this whole thing about this divergence of crows in Europe. And some of them are all black, and some of them are hooded. So they have that sort of grayish chest and back. So it looks like they're wearing an overcoat. And this is apparently there's some sort of divergence happening right in front of everybody, seeing this happen. Anyway, so, but this is where the confusion comes into. So she looks like this hooded crow. But people have questioned Neil about this, as to be expected. And Neil has said, definitely Jessamy is a raven. She just has a white breast. So she's just a special raven, and that's what she is. So she isn't in fact a crow. She's definitely a special raven with a white breast. So then with Matthew, he's a black raven. which is why it gets confusing, in terms of crow and raven. But we know that he is definitely a raven. So anyways, I just thought that was really interesting because I was starting to wonder about that myself because, are ravens also different in Europe? But no, they're black. So this was, and unsurprisingly, this was a thing that came up on the internet. So I wanted to add that. And then thinking back to John, and you're mentioning him being sort of innocent, and I know you were searching for a word, right? And I don't think, as you know, and as I could tell when you were talking about it, John really isn't innocent, but I think it's just like any kind of, villain, right? The villain never sees themselves as evil. I mean, there might be a few that, like Dr. Evil and things like that, where they would do a play on it. But, usually a villain usually sees themselves as justified and that they're innocent of wrongdoing, right? So, and I think that's sort of what's going on with John. And as you were alluding to in terms of Sandman and presenting these people just as humans, and this is what they do. This goes back to other things that Neil has written, right? So, even if you think of Good Omens, I mean, the demons can't even come up with things that are as bad to do to each other, I mean, for humans to do to each other, that they come up with on their own, right? So, so I think this is like a thing, and it comes up in many of Neil Gaiman's works about how people are, and that they have these sides to them, and that some people are they just do things that a lot of people just can't really understand. Like, it looks completely evil, but like you're seeing with John. He feels like he's innocent, like he had to do that. People forced him to do that because he was just protecting himself, right? So, and even with the Corinthian, I mean, he knows that he's doing something wrong, But I mean, you could say in his regard, I mean, he's a nightmare, so he kind of does that. But, but he has gone rogue on his own. I mean, he doesn't, But anyway, so humans are what they are, and they have these many sides to them. And how you look at it, in terms of the villain, like I said, very often sees themselves as innocent. And so then you start talking about all the other characters that are coming up. So I'm really looking forward to getting into those episodes as well. And I'm really getting a lot out of this deep dive into Sandman. So yeah, let's just keep doing this. Thank you for listening to our podcast discussing the first 3 chapters of The Sandman Season 1. We would love to keep the conversation going, so please comment and let us know what you thought. We're looking forward to quite a few new releases and events in the coming months, but we do plan to continue our discussion on the first season of The Sandman in future podcasts, so watch out for those. And until our next episode, thank you so much for being part of the Birds on Power Lines podcast.